Good afternoon, can folks online hear me okay? Oh, thank you.
I just brought that one.
That's fine. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So hope you had a nice lunch break. So we are back for module 2. This is my personal favorite module, not gonna lie. So I hope you enjoy it and find it interesting and informative before we get to kind of like the nitty-gritty how to do stuff tomorrow morning. Cecilia brought a copy of House Bill 2 of this year's GAA, if you're not familiar with it, and would like to take a look at it. Of course, you can also find it if you're online. You can find it on the legislature's website. Just go to their homepage, search for 2026 session House Bill 2, and it'll come up. So I'll leave this here over on the table if you want to, if you're not familiar with it, want to look through it, find all that good stuff. So just for your reference. Okay. So this afternoon, we're gonna do some history and some philosophy and some public administration and some economics and statistics and a little bit of everything. But I think you'll like it. So this is kind of like the why are we here portion of boot camp, right? Like what's this all for? Um, so budgeting is a core function of government, right? Like government has to have a budget. Government has to function. Government has to raise revenues and it has to appropriate expenditures, has to spend money to do stuff as the people in a democracy wanted to do, right? So the budget document is the most significant indicator of preferred policies by executive and legislative leadership, right? Like, what do you want the government to do? It's in the budget, okay? Um, and of course, it's crafted by legislators, it's signed by governors, it's proposed by agencies, and it's planned and executed by civil servants like all of us, right? So all of these different people have an effect on how the budget takes shape and how it gets implemented and executed. So that's kind of what we're talking about this afternoon. So a little bit of a module overview here. We'll talk about history of public or government budgeting in the United States and connect that to New Mexico. We'll look at how different states do their budgets and some similarities and differences. We'll give an overview of the New Mexico budget as it currently stands, saving and potential challenges in the future. And then we'll talk a little bit about budgeting scholarship. And if you're going to study budgeting, kind of like how do you approach it? And we'll talk about one guy, his name's Aaron Wildowski. And last, we'll close with something that's important to keep in mind as you all start preparing your FY28 budgets, and that is components of a good budget request. Okay, how to put things together, and questions to ask yourself and to answer as you're putting together your budget requests. So this poll is a few years old, but I think you would still find it very true today. And it's something I always like to show when I talk about this stuff, because it really gets at the core kind of dilemma the government faces when it does a budget. So basically, this is a poll, and they ask people, overall, do you think government spends too much or too little money, right? As average Americans, right? Well, 60% of Americans think that the government spends too much money. Okay. Then you ask the average American, well, what about these different areas? Education, healthcare, Social Security, Medicare, birth security. Well, look, the government spends too little on each of those areas, right? So you ask the average American, they think the government spends too much money, but they don't spend enough on the things they care about, right? So that's what we deal with when we are creating a budget, right? What is the proper balance of trying to figure out how much to spend overall and where to direct the funding. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about American history. Happy 250th birthday, right? I don't know why I'm having to admit, folks. Sorry. That. So we've got 250 years as a country, but as a political entity, we go back further than that, back to the colonies, right? And even before even before the revolution, we have this history of a struggle for budgeting between legislatures who control the purse strings and executive authority that's trying to maximize its power. Okay, that goes back even to the colonial era, where you had colonial legislatures that tried to control governors, right? The governors were usually appointed by the King of England. The legislators came from the colonies, and so they wanted to. I must have forgotten to let people bypass. Sorry about that. Um, the colonies wanted to exert some control on the governors, right? So they're trying to put all this restrictions and restraints, like requiring taxes and salaries to be renewed annually, right? So the king, the parliament in England responded by things like you probably learned about in American history, like the Stamp Act, which were attempts by parliament to free their own appointed governors from colonial legislative control, right? And what did that lead to? In part, that led to the American Revolution, those types of conflicts, right? Over how to spend money and who got to decide and make those decisions. So we had a revolution, as you know. We had a brief period of government under the Articles of Confederation that didn't work out so well. And so then we moved to the Constitution. So the first Constitution passed. This is your trivia fact for the day. The first budget passed under the Constitution was in 1789. It was one page long, and it was for $689,000, which translates, if you adjust for inflation, is about $26 million today. Okay? Now we're over $1 trillion. So we have grown the budget somewhat. Um, so after that, for most of the first part of first century or so, right up until about the Civil War, Congress was really the dominant factor in the budget process. This is annoying. In the budget process. So basically, they had most of the power. They were, hang on just 1 second. I'm going to try to adjust this because I can't keep doing this for the next hour. 1 second. Hopefully that fixed it. We'll see. Okay. So early years, you had, oh my God, maybe I just move this out of the way. Oh, it won't let me. That's cool. Oh, mute these notifications. There we go. Okay. So, like I said, Congress dominated the budget process for much of the early part of U.S. history. You had line item advocates, right? People who wanted very strict control over what was what in the budget, and they wanted to be very specific. They won out over Federalists. They wanted agencies to have a more broad spending power to be able to spend money as they wanted. But over time, you saw agencies gradually increasing their budget, being able to transfer funds from one purpose to another. So, um, so you might remember, again, from American history, kind of our first kind of political factions in this country. You had the Federalists. They were, as exemplified by Alexander Hamilton. They wanted deficits. They thought had this idea of, well, we're this new country and we want to be really cool. So what we need to do to get power is we need to spend deficit. We need to go into deficit spending now to build all these big projects, right? We like internal improvements. We want to build the Erie Canal, right? Connect the Great Lakes to New York and stuff like that. So that's going to like really let us grow, have a lot of economic and commercial power. And they ally themselves with industrialists who thought that's a great idea. Okay, so they taxed it mainly by tariffs during that era. On the other side, you had Jeffersonians, people like Thomas Jefferson. They thought that deficit spending was horrible. They thought it gave too much power to the central government, and that interest payments were redistributing wealth from poor to the rich. So they were against all this stuff. So you had those two factions kind of fighting it out, and you had basically had kind of a slowly growing balanced budget was the general results. Okay, the first big crisis for the budget was, of course, the Civil War. As we all know, wars are very expensive. And so financial controls just kind of went out the window, right? President Lincoln asked for a whole bunch of extra powers and money and stuff to fight the Civil War. He got it. And, once you give that sort of stuff, it's kind of difficult to take it back afterwards, right? So after that, you've got presidents gain more discretion over funding. Agencies demanded it. Now you're getting into what's called the Gilded Age. That's where you really saw the rise of like interest groups and bureaucratic machines and party politics and all this stuff and back scratching deals and lobby, right? This is where the term lobbyist comes from. All that stuff kind of emerged during this kind of post-Civil War era. Also, the idea of iron triangles, which are basically like a triangle you think of with the points being agencies, public stakeholders, like, for example, defense contractors and congressional allies begin to form. So basically, you have these alliances of these three-pronged, Congress, for example, if I'm a congressman from Virginia, let's just say, and I've got a lot of defense contractors in my district, I want to fund the defense contractors, and the Department of Defense also wants those defense contractors to get a lot of money. So you've got these alliances forming, those the kind of three-part alliances forming, and that really has a lot of effect on the budget as well. Okay, and this led to things like the military, like I was kind of hinting at, the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned about in his 1960 farewell address. If you never listen to that address, I highly recommend it. It's because it's coming from this guy who's he was the leader of the Allied forces in World War II, career military guy. Then he was president for 2 terms, and he leaves the office basically by warning us about the dangers of the military-industrial complex. So it's a good listen. So we have always have these eras that are kind of balances between each other. So Gilded Age kind of gave way to what's known as the Progressive Era in the early 1900s. So we had all this corruption and waste, especially in city governments. Have you ever heard of things like Tammany Hall and like Boss Tweed and all that stuff? Like that's very Gilded Age. And so you had these progressive reformers that kind of tried to fight against that. They wanted budget reforms. They wanted transparency. And they thought, well, they saw basically the system of like whoever greases the wheels gets the money and so let's go clear to the opposite side of that. Let's remove politics from the process altogether, and let's do it by science, basically. And so we're going to apply the scientific method and try to create some kind of unbiased, practical system of appropriating funds, right? So they believe that budgeting should be left completely to administrators, right? Take out the politics entirely and just let administrators do the budgeting. And so that kind of created this push and pull tug of war thing that we still deal with today, called the politics versus administration dichotomy, right? Like you can make the argument that, yeah, budgeting should be left to administrators, but also how democratic is that, right? Like how responsive is that to what the people demand? How much should we listen to what the people demand and through themselves and their elected representatives, right? So how responsive should budget administrators be to public demand? Okay. Of course, we had another war, we had another debt, okay, as always happens. And so after World War I, you get some reforms that lead to what we might consider modern budget practices. So in 1921, you had the Budget Accounting Act. So that created the Bureau of the Budget at the federal level. Today, that's known as the Office of Management and Budget. And that's basically what every state budget office is modeled after. Okay, so that's the OMB is the federal equivalent of the state budget division. Okay. But it did also give president a lot more control over agency budgets. And yeah, like I said, most modern state budget processes follow the model that was established here. Some more reforms after that. So of course, then we had another war, World War II, which was also very expensive. And of course, all the growth of federal, not just World War II, but you had the New Deal in the 30s and all those new programs under FDR, which were also expensive. So you had this is the first time you had the idea of maybe we should actually try to track what this money is going towards and what it's doing. So after World War II. So this is the introduction of the idea of performance budgeting, okay, and performance measures and stuff like that. So yeah, design budgets that achieve objectives as efficiently as possible, right? Not just throwing money out the window and hoping for the best, right? Like trying to actually measure this kind of stuff. Okay. Then you have some more. Congress kind of came back in the 70s. They tried to reassert control. They created the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Act, and they created their own budget office. Okay, so they created the Congressional Budget Office, which is the federal equivalent of our LFC. Okay, so Congress has their own LFC as well. You had in the 80s, you had the Deficit Control Act. So now we're getting into deficit spending, right? We're getting into the federal the federal government having a deficit basically every year. So they tried to get a hold of that through various means. Didn't work out so well. Today, here's some stuff that's happened in the past few years. The deficit, of course, has continued to grow for all of these factors that you see here. The last balanced budgets were passed in the late 90s. If you're old enough to remember that, you might remember like one of the arguments in the 2000 presidential election was, what do we do with the budget surplus? Which seems kind of crazy to think about now. But that was the thing. That was a topic of discussion. So what's caused the growth of the budget? So you think of the overall debt, which is, God, I don't know, 19 trillion, 20 trillion or something like that the federal government has. And the deficit, which is, every year's expenditures minus revenues, right? So the expenditures being higher and contributing to the debt over time. So you have things like growth and entitlement spending, right? Medicaid, Medicare, all that stuff. The Bush and Trump era tax cuts, war on terror, of course, very expensive. And then you had Great Recession, right? That hit. And they passed, in response to the Great Recession, Congress passed the ARA, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, I believe, I remember right, 2009. If I remember right, that was about $800 billion, which seems just small compared to what got passed after COVID. Then you had COVID, you had the CARES Act and all sorts of stuff. Then you had under President Biden, you had things like ARPA and the Inflation Reduction Act. And then last year you had the one big beautiful bill, HR1, whatever you want to call it. All this stuff not really helping the budget much. Okay, so that's kind of where we're at now. A couple things a couple specific topics to talk about. One is earmarks. So earmarks is just, basically you see this at both the state level and the federal level. Are Congress folks going in and very specifically saying, devote $100 million to this purpose, probably in my district, right? And so these increased dramatically in the 20th century because this was legislators again trying to like take back some of the control that agencies were having over spending money. They wanted to make sure that money was at least some of that money was coming back to their districts, right? And of course, you've got once this became a thing, external actors were like, oh, well, we can tell our Congress people, well, get us that, get us this, right? And they would, follow suit. So there are arguments on both sides of this, right? Like the kind of anti-earmark argument is like, oh, this is pork barrel politics, right? Or this is the bridge to nowhere, if you remember that. Like it's wasteful government spending, it's just handouts to people, blah, blah, blah. Okay, there's merit to that. But on the other side, you can argue that what are these folks elected to do? They're elected to bring home the goods, right, to their district, right? So if congressperson gets up and says, I got us $2 million in grants for this purpose, for this hospital or this senior center or something like that. Like that's an earmark, right? If it was directed towards that place, then that was an earmark. So is there something wrong with that? And then also is that kind of like the grease that's needed to get some budgets done, right? Like, because basically no legislator likes everything that's in a budget, right? Even if they end up voting for it, they probably don't like everything that's in it. So getting a few earmarks can make it go down a little bit easier, right? It'll be like, okay, well, give me this, and that, and I'll vote for it. A big one that you might remember from last year in HR1 was what do they call it? The Alaska carve out or something like that. Which was, had to deal with, this is not exactly an earmark, it's like a special policy carve out, right? Where, they were going to punish states with high error rates on SNAP, on food stamps, right? And well, Alaska was one of those states that had a high error rate. And to pass the bill, they needed Senator Lisa Murkowski's vote, right? So what they do, they said, well, okay, Alaska, your rate is so high, we're going to give you like an extra few years, or I don't remember all the details, so don't quote me on this. Basically, we're going to give you an extra few years to fix it, right? And so it created this kind of perverse system where if your error rate is really high, you're kind of good for a few years, and then if it's lower. So, but that's what they did to get her vote. So, such as this. Okay, the other thing is contracts. So the idea of this kind of comes back to the idea that you've heard for, 30, 40, 50 years now. We need to run government like a business, right? We need to, and one aspect of that is farming out work to an ever increasing number of contractors who compete for government funds. Now, on its face, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Like if it's a good competitive process, right? You've got people competing for these contracts, and you hope that you've got someone that's going to evaluate it and follow all the New Mexico procurement code and all that good stuff, and you're going to award a high quality contract to somebody who's going to do it for a reasonable price, right? That's what you hope. Right? That's the kind of idea, and that's not bad. But it's not always, well, it doesn't always work out that way. And I'm not talking, necessarily about New Mexico here. This could be anywhere, but salaries and overhead costs can be much actually higher than government workers, and sometimes maybe you don't see that. You just see like, oh well, this contract has $1 million for salaries. I don't know how many people that's paying or what they're making or something like that. It might not be as transparent. Competition for contracts has declined. So that's another thing. Like if there's less competition, then you might get more no bid contracts that aren't having to really fight for it and provide those services more effectively or efficiently. And then especially if we look at the federal government. So nowadays, the federal contractor workforce, you talk about 80% of all IT staff that work for the federal government are contractors. And actually, these stats are a couple of years old, so they might not be quite they might not be quite true anymore. But I'll tell you this: at least a few years ago, this was where it was. 90% of all Department of Energy operations, right? If you know someone who works for Los Alamos or Sandia, they are a federal contractor, right? They don't work directly for the federal government; they're a contractor. So these folks are a shadow workforce of up to 7.5 million people, where there's about 2 million actual federal workers if you take out the military and the postal service, the two big ones, right? So it's an issue, right? And I'm not coming down on one side or the other, but these are things to keep in mind. Okay, so kind of summing up the history of public budgeting in the U.S. So like I said, there are many, of course, many conflicts among different groups, but the traditional budget process served the U.S. well for about 200 years. But kind of since the 60s, 70s or so, you've had the growth of entitlement and deficit spending, and that's greatly complicated things. So, and by entitlement, that word can sometimes be a little bit politically charged. So I just want to be clear here. By entitlement, all I mean is formula-driven mandatory spending, right? No connotations to it. So it just means if you meet these qualifications, you are entitled to the money, right? Not like, oh, I'm so entitled, right? It just means you are entitled to the money. Right? So there's been lots of reforms attempted, but really only small gradual steps have been achieved. Those have been limited by political fights and again the growth in entitlement spending. Right. The budget grew incrementally from 1971 to 2010 with only spikes in response to major events. Okay. But since then it's grown quite a bit. So let's talk a little bit about New Mexico. So we're about 115 years old as a state. We've had generally the same budgeting process throughout much of New Mexico history. And, you've seen a lot of those same sort of executive and legislative branch push and pull tensions over the budget process that you've seen, at the federal level, you've seen at the state level too. And sometimes that's even within the same party. If the same party controls the governor and the legislature, sometimes, they don't have the same ideas on how to spend money, even if they're the same party. Of course, debates over use of and reliance on oil and gas revenue. Of course, we'll talk more about this here in a bit. We are a huge oil and gas state. We are the number 2 oil producer in the country behind Texas, and that provides about, I believe it's, if I remember right, between 35 and 40% of our general fund revenue, right? So debates over how to spend that money, that's a big one. Okay. Consolidation of expenditure categories. So if you go back and you look at a budget bill from like the 90s, you will see that it will look a little different. And the main difference is that there used to be more expenditure categories. So they used to be broken out by travel was its own line. Supplies was its own line and stuff like that. So a lot of like what's now wrapped up into the 400 category was its own separate lines. So that means that the legislature actually appropriated at that level, right? So kind of like the grand compromise that happened when the Accountability in Government Act was passed was that those expenditure categories got collapsed. So they went from 12 or so, something like that, down to 4. Okay? So the idea was that we're going to start having these performance measures that we want agencies to be accountable for and report on, and in exchange for that, we will give you more flexibility over parts of your budget, right? Like we'll put everything in the other category together, so you don't have a very strict travel and supplies budget anymore. Now it's like, oh, if you've got excess travel budget, you can move it over to supplies. You don't have to ask anybody to do that. You can just do it because it's all in the same category, right? So that's kind of like the increased flexibility that agencies have now. Okay. Junior bills. This I mentioned because this was something that started happening, with the increase in revenue and especially the availability of non-recurring revenue and general fund and availability to spend that. So basically, these were the first one, at least in this era. I think there were maybe some back in the Richardson era, but that's before my time. Uh, there was one, and the first one was in 2019, and it was a separate bill from the budget, right? That just had hundreds of, for lack of a better term, earmarks, right? Little appropriations, basically kind of whatever the legislators wanted to put in, usually to their districts or whatever for $100,000 here, $200,000 there, something like that. Okay. And those were called junior bills. I don't know who first coined that term. It wasn't me, but that's just how they were called. So there were a few of them for a few years. I think there wasn't one in 2020 because of COVID, but there was one in most years. And then something called the Grow Fund came along. That was in 2024. The AC is out in our office. Sorry. Kind of like here. Oh, sorry. So anyway, so in 2024, this new fund called the Grow Fund, the Government Results and Opportunity Fund, was created, and so they kind of got used in two ways. One way was as state agency pilot projects, and the other way was for basically for junior bills. So it kind of replaced the junior bill process. And so you had 2 years ago in 2024, in Section 9D of House Bill 2, you had a bunch of small appropriations, just like in prior year junior bills. And if you look in this year's GAA, you'll find the same thing in Section 9D. So that's kind of what has happened. Again, kind of going back to the earmark thing, is this legislators responding to voters, or is it an unnecessary complication of the budget process? Who's to say? This process is probably here to stay as long as there's money available for these kind of non-recurring appropriations. One kind of interesting thing is that the state constitution actually limits the House Bill 2, the GAA, to appropriations to those expenditures that are required under existing law. So, one theory is that's why the junior bill stuff gets shoved into a different bill. Of course, now it's in House Bill 2. I don't know. I think that part of the Constitution gets read a little generously, let's say. But that's one interesting wrinkle. Okay, quick look about how different states do different things. So like I mentioned, many of the same factors influencing the federal budget process affect states as well. One key difference, of course, is that every state has to pass a balanced budget, right? And the federal government does not. So that's a big, that can be a big challenge, especially in hard fiscal times. You have to do hard things, but also New Mexico doesn't have $19 trillion in debt. So that's one good thing. So like I said this morning, the majority of states enact annual budgets, but there's about 19 or so that are biennial. Some states have longer legislative sessions. They have full-time. Here in New Mexico, we have a short-term, kind of part-time legislature, right? They only meet 30 or 60 days a year. In some states, the legislature meets almost all year round, kind of except for election season, right? They'll take a few months off before and after the election. But other than that, they're always on. And so they can take a lot longer to pass budgets because they have the time. So they take the time. So I mentioned this before. New Mexico is one of the few states where both the executive and the legislature publish budget recs. And also, like I mentioned, governors have different levels of veto powers. Again, that's all dependent on how each state writes its constitution. Some have no line item veto power, basically, and even on the budget. They either have to take everything in the budget or turn it down. Some have very powerful line item veto power. They can actually change appropriation amounts. They can veto words, they can veto numbers and string things together. And I'll show you the example of that here on the next slide. Obviously, as you can probably imagine, the legislature usually does not like that. So they might, if they don't like something, they might challenge it on legal grounds. Sometimes they might even try to override the vetoes. New Mexico, it's pretty hard to overturn a legislative veto. Basically, it has to be a 2/3 majority in both houses to override a governor's veto. And they can do that either during the session or, if they really want to do it, they can call themselves back into what's called an extraordinary session. I think that, if I remember right, don't quote me on this, I think that requires a 2/3 vote of both houses to bring themselves back. I haven't seen that happen, but they could possibly do it. If they got really mad at the governor, I guess they could do it. So like I said this morning, in New Mexico, it's a line item veto that's limited to bills containing appropriations, but it can be used for non-appropriation purposes within those bills. So you can strike language that's not necessarily directly in an appropriation in those bills. So this is an example I like to use of one of the most powerful governor line item vetoes. This comes from Wisconsin, and it's called the Franken veto. So it's been used quite a while. This is my former colleagues here who applied this veto. If you look here, down the bottom left, they vetoed the parts in red. So that it ended up saying basically for the limit for the 2023 to 2024, for the 2023 to the 24-25 school year, right? So they funded this school program for 400 years by striking the words and the hyphen there in red. And as you can imagine, this was challenged by the legislature. It went to the Wisconsin Supreme Court and it was upheld as a legal veto. The New Mexico governor cannot do this. A little bit of differences in revenue structures. Of course, states can choose in how they raise revenue for their budget. So, for example, 7 states have no income tax. A couple only tax interest and dividend income. 5 states have no sales tax. Okay, so I always like to say, a good place to live might be in Vancouver, Washington, which is right across the border from Portland. So you work in Vancouver, Washington, you don't pay any income tax. You cross the river, you do all your shopping in Portland where you don't pay any sales tax. Just a hot tip if you're ready to retire. So there are some states that don't have any sales tax sorry, let me start that again. Most states don't tax food, right? They don't have sales tax on food, especially at least food that you buy in grocery stores, right? But there are some that still do that. Those 7 or so that you see there. See, I grew up in Kansas, and until recently, Kansas didn't either. They finally passed that a couple years ago. So when I moved to a state that doesn't pay tax on food, that was like crazy to me. But yeah, in some states you do pay tax on food. Okay. Of course, you've got energy states: Alaska, New Mexico, Texas, North Dakota. They're raising a lot of revenue for what are called severance taxes. I kind of like how they call it severance taxes. It means, think about it, you are severing the oil from the ground, right, and collecting taxes on that. So you get lots of choices about how to spend that money. Alaska has a permanent fund where every citizen or every resident of Alaska gets, money every year, etc., stuff like that. New Mexico, we have giant permanent funds that have a lot of money. Appropriation is the expenditures. We'll talk about this here in a minute. But education, health, and human services dominate most state budgets. Education being both K-12 and higher education, funding of public universities. Health and human services going to be the state share of Medicaid. So those are the big spending items in pretty much all state budgets. And then they might have many different options in how they appropriate. Might be very high level lump sum, or some states might get very, very specific in how they do things. And again, it's kind of up to that state. If you're interested in more of this comparative stuff, a couple websites to check out. NASBO is our professional organization, the National Association of State Budget Officers. So I belong to that, and everyone in our office belongs to that. But they on their website they have some good like comparative reports about budget processes in different states and budget summaries, all that stuff. So if you're interested in how different states do things, that's a website to check out. And the NCSL, National Conference of State Legislatures, they do a lot of the same stuff, but from more of a state legislative perspective. Okay, this last slide here, and then we'll take a little break. So this is something that also something that comes up a lot, and this is called the state federal balance of payments, or as you might have heard, something like the maker versus taker states, or things like that. So this is from a couple years ago, and you can see this basically the dollar figure there is how much money does the state get back for every dollar they pay in federal taxes. Okay, so as you can see, 47 states are what you might call taker states, if you want to use that terminology, right? Only Washington, Massachusetts, and New Jersey put more in than they get back. Okay. During the height of COVID, this was all blue. There were no states that were kind of in the red. Before COVID, there were a few more. So a few more red states like this. Okay. But of course, as you can see, New Mexico is number one. For every dollar that we pay in federal taxes, we get back $3.21. So why is that? Now, it's tempting to say, oh, it's because we have such a high population on Medicaid or SNAP or other entitlement programs. That's certainly part of it, but it's not the whole story. We're not number one here. So we are in the top 10, I think, but several states are higher per capita in terms of receiving federal entitlement programs. Florida is higher than us per capita, for example. We have some other factors that are contributing to this. So we have 2 national labs. We have a few military bases, right? That all counts as federal spending coming back to New Mexico. We've got a lot of tribal lands and tribal communities, so there's federal spending there that also counts. And we've got federal mineral leasing payments, right? So the oil, gas money and stuff that's made on federal lands, we get a chunk of that in New Mexico. Okay, so that all counts as contributing to why we are number one on this graph. Okay. All right, so let me check for questions here. Second. Any questions on teams? Oops. Any questions here in the audience? Okay, let's take like a 10-minute break. We'll start again at 2:00 and we'll wrap things up for the day. Okay. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So before I go back to the slides, I wanted to show this graph here. This is why I do not envy the folks on the Craig, on the revenue estimating group. If you look, this is the path, this is the price of oil. West Texas Intermediate, which is the main oil that we care about in New Mexico. You have to look from March through today and look at, this is what they have to try to make sense of in building in a price of oil for the next year to base the revenue projections off of, right? So it was pretty steady. It was pretty low, actually. And then the whole thing with Iran started and went up and down, up and down. And then last month, is it over? Maybe. So now it's down back under 70. And now maybe it's back on again. So now it's back up to 80, right? $80 a barrel. So each dollar, God, I can't remember. I don't know, Cecilia, to remember. It's each dollar affects the revenue to general fund by like 30 to 40 million or something like that. It's something crazy like that. So the Craig has to try to come at and figure out what's the best price of oil that we are going to build into the revenue forecast for next year based on this. That's not, I don't envy their job. All right, let's go back to the slides. Sorry, one second. Okay, so let's talk about that general fund. So here is the general fund history since about FY17 coming back to going up forward to current year, FY27. So as you can see, our general fund budget has grown by 84% over the past decade, from about 6 billion in FY18 to just over 11 billion for FY27. So what has all that money been put toward? Well, you can see the big things here. Like I mentioned earlier, compensation is expensive. And so a lot of that has gone towards compensation for all compensation increases for all employees. Now, I mean all, I mean state employees, I mean higher education employees, I mean public school employees, right? The state funds, all of those. And for several years, it was 3 or 4% a year, right? And the rate for all of us, but like I said, that's expensive. That's several $100 million right there. Okay, so keep that in mind. Let's see, K-12, other K-12 education increases and some reforms to the public school funding formula. So like you'll see in a pie chart here in a couple slides, but again, K-12 education is the single biggest piece of the general fund budget, and that's increased from $2.6 billion to $4.8 billion in FY27. Medicaid, also, pretty expensive. That's increased from $930 million to $1.43 billion. So those are right there. We've covered, between those three things, we've covered a big majority of that increase, right? Basically. Higher education, the Opportunity Scholarship, that is now funded on a recurring basis. So that is built into the base budget. So you see that reflected as well. I think that's $150 million a year, something like that. And then the rest is just kind of, and the rest, you might say, right? Like economic development, public safety, and natural resources initiatives. A lot of that stuff has been non-recurring. So again, one time. And so over here on the right, you see the line graph that shows the increase in non-recurring appropriations. This is most of them. This is just section 5, the special appropriations. So it's even not all of the non-recurring stuff. It's a good chunk of it. It's a majority of it. But as you can see, starting in 2023, there's really just a lot of capacity for these non-recurring appropriations. So you've seen a pretty big increase in them up to 1.5 almost $1 billion. So here's the pie chart I was referring to. So the top graph here is this is how the general fund budget is split among program areas. So like I said, K-12 education is the number one at about $4.9 billion. Health and Human Services, number two at $3 billion. So, about half of that or so is the state share of Medicaid. Okay, but that block also includes the Department of Health, all the state hospitals, early childhood, so the general fund portion of the early childhood, education and care department, children, youth, and families, and the environment department. Those all are included in the Health and Human Services block. You've got higher ed, 1.5 billion. So the general fund portion of all of our public universities is there. And then kind of like, again, and the rest. Public safety, that's, state police, corrections, so it's 109 million. And then transportation, you'll notice is zero. That's because the Department of Transportation does not receive any recurring general fund in its base budget. Okay, their budget is big. It's almost $1.5 billion, I think. But it comes from the road fund. So like your gas tax and your state gas tax and like your license fees and all that stuff, car license fees, those go into the road fund. And then they also get several $100 million of federal funding that goes into their base budget. However, for the past several years, DOT has gotten a lot of non-recurring general fund appropriations. So really, they get a few $100 million of general fund a year, at least for the past several years. It's just that it is technically appropriated as non-recurring, and that's for stuff like road construction projects and maintenance and stuff like that. Okay. Down below here, you see this is the breakout by revenue category. So you can see that general fund, that $11 billion, is only about a third of the budget. Okay, federal funds is 40%. Again, that's most of that is the federal share of Medicaid. Other state funds, again, that's your fees and your licenses and all that stuff, about 20%, and transfers, the lowest is 7%. So all together, do I have it on the next slide? Yeah, so all together, so this is your total funds budget. So general fund is 11 billion. The total budget from all funding sources in FY27 is $33.5 billion. Okay, so that's the total size of the New Mexico budget. So what are the big differences you see between what I showed you, between this one and what I just showed you, the general fund? So the big thing you'll see is almost half the pie here is Health and Human Services. Now it's $17 billion. Okay, so that's federal, that's Medicaid. We get, I think it's over $12 billion from federal funding for Medicaid, because the match is about, it's about 25.75. I don't know exactly off the top of my head, but it's roughly that, right? For every, $1 state money that we put in, we get $3 federal money, basically. You'll see transportation now shows up at $1.4 billion. Again, that's road fund and federal funds. Education only goes up to 5.4, so like most of it is general fund, right? 4.9 of that is general fund. Higher ed goes up quite a bit to $4.8 billion. That because that's including all their tuition fees and stuff now in their total budget. And then you have the other ones there. So that's the total size of the state budget. This is what our balance sheet looks like for FY27. Now, of course, one caveat here is this is, again, revenue is always changing. This is basically right after the budget was signed by the governor. This is what FY27 looked like. So this will probably look a little bit different next month, because the Craig will probably come up with a different number for FY27 estimated recurring general fund revenue. That will probably go in some different way. Okay. So you can see our estimated general fund recurring revenue is $13.9 billion for FY27, almost 14. So then you can see how was that spent in the next three lines. So recurring appropriations was 11.1. Okay, so that's where you have this gap, right? Because we are taking in, recurring revenue is almost 14 billion. On a recurring basis, we're spending just over 11, right? So that leaves this gap that's available for other uses. So that's why you've got $2.2 billion in non-recurring, and another 443 million for capital, which is basically also non-recurring. Okay, so your total appropriations added up to $13.8 billion, and transfer from the operating reserves. Actually, sorry, that should be transferred to the operating reserve, because our total revenue is about $130 million over our total appropriations. So we enacted a balanced budget for FY27 by $130 million is basically what that's saying. We have 130 million plus. Now, if the economy crashes during FY27, that could change. We hope that doesn't happen. But based on our revenue estimates, this is where we're at. Okay. And then this looks at the next few lines here are the balance of the general fund, where we're expected to end up. And so your reserves, 26.4%. And that basically means take your general fund balance and divide it by your recurring appropriations, and that's how we calculate reserves. Okay, and that's really important to have a high reserve level, because that's basically just telling you, how much money have you got set aside if times go bad and you need to kind of like dip into that stuff, right? And you need to call a special session to take some extraordinary measures, kind of like what's the state of revenue that's available for doing some of that stuff. Okay. It actually used to be over 30%. The only reason why it's under 30%, like I said here, is there are certain funds that are counted as part of reserves. And one of them was the growth fund, the government results and opportunity fund, that has like $600 million in it, I think. The legislature decided that they were not going to count that that fund as a reserve fund starting in FY27. So basically, if that were still there, it would be over 30, but they took it out. 26 is still good. And you can kind of see that here. This is kind of, so again, you can see kind of where the reserves went here. We started, you can go back in FY17, we were under 10% in reserves. And it's pretty funny. In our office, we have some executive budget recommendations dating back to like the 1960s. And it's fun to read through those old documents, and they're very proud of themselves for setting aside like 2% in reserves. Now we're up to 26. So that's pretty good. So yeah, reserves have grown due to increased revenue and setting aside more money into reserve funds. Okay. And again, I showed you that graph of the oil price, right? That's revenue volatility. That's kind of the main challenge we have in New Mexico in terms of revenue, is that volatility from oil and gas, and trying to move away from that volatility. So it's really good to be able to try to maintain a high level of reserves, because if the price of oil tanks down to $40 a barrel or something bad like that, that's going to have some effects, right? We're going to have to do some stuff. And that reserves level helps us do that stuff without, feeling too much pain, basically. So one way that the legislature and the government have been working together to take some of all this money that we've been getting over the past few years, and set some of it aside and kind of generate more money for the future when, we might not be having this oil boom that we've had the past few years. That came in 2023. It was called Senate Bill 26. And what that did was it kind of set a cap of oil and gas revenue into the general fund, and said, okay, any oil and gas revenue that comes in that's above that cap is instead going to go into a permanent fund, the severance tax permanent fund, right? And that fund is going to be invested, it's going to generate revenue, and it's going to grow, right? So because stuff has been so good, the severance tax permanent fund is expected to grow from about $10 billion to $45 billion by 2035, right? So that fund is currently kind of locked away. It can't be gotten at, but eventually that will be a good source of revenue, and the legislature can decide, okay, we've socked away all this money now, and maybe the oil boom is over. We are not getting as much money from oil and gas revenue. Now we've got this trust fund, this permanent fund that we can dip into. And so, we talk about diversifying our economy and our revenue streams. We want to diversify economy into other stuff, not just oil and gas. Revenue streams here. This is just enabling us to collect more money and earn more money from, interest and investments, and not so much from revenue. Okay, so that's one good thing that's been done on a bipartisan manner by both the legislature and the executive over the past few years. Okay, so you can see we've got pretty healthy balances in a couple of reserve funds, and all of this contributes to our credit rating. Credit rating is important because that helps us do bonding, access the credit markets at reasonable rates. And so good news is that in January of this year, Moody's, which is one of the major credit rating agencies, upgraded our rating from AA2 to AA1, which is pretty good. It's not the highest, but it's pretty good, especially for a state kind of our size, right? And correspondingly, last year in May 2025, the US's rating was downgraded to AA1. So we now have little New Mexico now has the same credit rating as the United States. It's pretty good. Okay, we talked a little bit about new money this morning. Let's revisit here for a bit. So you can see here the bar. Let me explain the bar graph first. So this comes from the Craig. It's one of their most useful graphs you'll find when they release their revenue forecasts. So you've got the blue bars are your recurring appropriations. Okay, this is a little out of date, but in the FY27, but it's for our purposes, it's good. So the blue bars are your recurring appropriations. Your gray bars are your non-recurring appropriations, your one-time spending, right? And then your black line there is the revenue forecast. Okay, the recurring revenue forecast. So like I was saying this morning, new money used to be calculated by taking the black line, wherever that's at, and just subtracting the blue bar, where that's at. So you had this gap, and the gap got to be, it's not so bad when the gap isn't so big back in FY19, FY20, but you get to like FY24 and 25, the gap starts to get multi-billions of dollars, and that gets a little ridiculous. It's just not accurate of how much money is available and how much money is to be spent, and how New Mexico is actually spending its money, because it's spending these big chunks of non-recurring appropriations. So starting last year for FY20, or no, 2 years ago, sorry, FY26, they changed the definition of new money, and they added in the non-recurring appropriations. Basically, however much they spent last year, they kind of assumed they'll spend the same amount next year. So now new money is kind of like the black line minus the whole entire bar. Okay, so that basically reduces the total money, but you have to think of it as that's how much money is available for new recurring stuff. If you assume that you're going to spend the same amount of money on non-recurring stuff. Okay, so I know it's a little complicated, but it's pretty important to understand, because when the new money went down from $2 billion to a couple $100 million, it wasn't because the revenue tanked or anything. It's just because they changed the calculation, right? So the revenue forecast, we had these big boom years, kind of FY23, FY25. Those were the real big boom years, down when oil was really pumping down in the Permian Basin, right down in southeast New Mexico, Carlsbad and all that area, right? So it's still coming, right? But it's slowing down. Okay, the revenue growth is not as much as it was. Okay, so that's kind of unless something crazy happens, which I'm not an economist. So who knows? But unless something crazy happens, that's generally what's expected for the next few years. It's just kind of like modest general fund growth, still growing, but not growing as much as it did during the boom years. Okay. Now, the good thing is that because we've got this gap between the black line and the blue bar, we can take a hit without really having to cut into agencies' operating budgets, right? Like this blue line, like we could go down to 12, we could go from 14 billion in recurring revenue to 12 billion in recurring revenue. And what we would have to do is basically cut back a lot on non-recurring appropriations, right? But technically we wouldn't have to touch agency budgets or public school support recurring because we'd still be above the blue bar. Okay. Now that's what we have. That's kind of like what we would have to do. The legislature might choose to do other things, right? If we get to that point, they might say like, well, everyone needs some to share in the pain, so we're going to cut everyone's general fund budget by 3% anyway. Who knows? I don't speak for the legislature, but that is something they could do. Okay, so really important to mention this morning, the next Craig revenue estimate will be in August, like mid-month. That will be the first revenue estimate for FY28. So that'll be really important to tune into, because that will determine, basically that will set the revenue levels for both the executive and LFC's budget recommendations for FY28. So what happens when times get tough? So it's just important to keep these kind of things in mind, right? There are some things that can happen because I'm going to be honest, we've had it really good for the past several years, right? We've seen the oil boom, the revenue has been going up and up. There hasn't been much pain. There was a brief little weird thing that happened, at the beginning of COVID when, you probably remember a few days where the gas was like $1 a gallon, and that was crazy. And we had to do some cutbacks in response to that. We had to take away the salary increase that was passed for FY21. I think it was only 1 or 2%, so it wasn't huge, but still, it sucks. So we had to do that, and we had to cut some appropriations. So there was that, right? But other than that, rebounded really quickly, and we got back on our feet within a year. And it's been all smooth sailing since then, really. Before that, there were some cuts in 2016 and 2017. We were doing some cuts. We were sweeping a lot of funds back then there briefly for a while. And then the Great Recession, of course, before that was when there were like furloughs and stuff like that. So what can happen when we need to address some things to balance the budget? Well, all the big stuff requires legislative approval. So probably this is going to require a special session, right? The governor is going to issue the call, and they have to come back basically and have to address, the governor says we need to balance the budget, we need to take these actions. They come back and they pass a bill to do various things, right? So what could they do? They could do, like I mentioned, they could do across the board general fund budget reductions, right? So they could reduce everybody, like 1% of the budget is, $111 million, right? So if they need to save $200 million, they could pass 2% budget cut to everyone, including public schools, and go home. Done, right? They could do that. So that's kind of a scythe and not a scalpel, right? But it is a way to do it. So clawbacks of capital or non-recurring appropriation balances, right? If they just in the regular session, if they appropriated $1 billion for non-recurring and capital stuff and none of that's been spent yet, they'd be like, well, we're taking that all back because we need to put it back into savings into the general fund. Okay, so they can do that. Sweeping balances of agency special revenue funds. So if any of those funds are out there and they have some balances, they can write language to take those balances and put it to the general fund. There might be some exceptions, if some special revenue funds are very tied to certain federal programs, and the federal government says, if you take this money and spend it for something else, you will lose it, right? So there might be some funds that are protected like that. But if it's a state fund that was created purely for a state purpose, they can probably rate it, okay? And they will if they need to. Okay. Repealing statewide salary increases, like I said, that happened in 2020. And then replacing general fund in the budget with other available revenue sources. So, like in early COVID, they had the coronavirus relief fund that was passed by Congress, sent a lot of money out to states that could replace some general fund. And then if other agencies have special revenue funds available that they need to use to plug some general fund gaps, they might do that as well. Okay, and the tricky part is for some of these agencies is that if the legislature decides to do that, and then times get better, it's always hard to get general fund increases, right? So it's hard for the agency to be like, okay, you used my special fund for the year because general fund was tight. That's fine. But now times are better. Can I have the general fund back? And they're probably like, no, like you still got this fund. So that's the tricky part, right? So in terms then of executive actions, the governor or other executives in the legislature, like or in the state, like other elected officials or the judiciary, there's only certain things that they can do, right? So they can institute hiring freezes, right? They can just stop hiring, hope you save money by, kind of the natural flow of things, right? Like, people leave and then you just don't fill a position. So that's going to save some money. Of course, delaying optional expenses, looking to take a hard look at your budget and be like, what do we have to spend on? What do we have to fund this year? What can we wait until next year? Things like that. So we, the state budget division, has the authority to reduce non-general fund budgets. Okay, so federal funds or special revenue funds. And this is really important, not just in bad times, but anytime. Anytime that you're looking at your budget projections, and we'll talk more about this tomorrow morning, you're looking at your budget and you're saying, I got this grant canceled, or my fund revenue is tracking, 25% below where we are expecting and where we're budgeted at. It's really important that you let us know because we have the authority to reduce your budget accordingly, right? And we want to do that because we don't want you to get in the position where you are spending money you don't have. Because you might say, okay, our federal budget for this year is $5 million. And so on July 1st, you have $5 million in budget, right? You find out in March, let's say, oh, we're losing $1 million of our federal budget. We don't only have $4 million of federal revenue available, right? Unless you change your budget or reduce your budget with us through a bar, you still have $5 million of budget available, right? Because that's what was set up based on what you knew best back in July. So the danger that can happen is that you don't tell us, you don't figure it out or whatever, you keep spending up to that $5 million and then you're like, oops, I don't have the revenue to support that. And then you've overspent you technically haven't overspent your budget, at least your original budget, you've overspent your revenue available. And now you have a deficiency and now you're explaining you or your agency director or cabinet secretary or whoever is explaining to the legislature what happened and why you needed a deficiency appropriation. Okay, so it's very important that we work with you to reduce your budgets if they are declining to match actual revenue to avoid that situation. We do not have the authority to reduce general fund budgets. Okay, only the legislature can do that. Okay. Some factors that will influence future budgets. Like I've mentioned a few times here, we'll see the FY28 revenue forecast in August. That will be determine the price of oil, and that'll be determined, of course, by the price of oil. Again, shows you that graph. So good luck figuring that out. The level of drilling activity, it'll probably be kind of level out. I would assume. Again, I'm not an economist, so I can't say for sure. Take all this stuff with a grain of salt. Impact of tariffs, war in the Middle East, other current projected economic conditions like where's inflation at, tourism, labor market, all that good stuff. Federal funding changes, we saw a lot of that last year, and we'll probably continue seeing some of that this year as the Medicaid and the SNAP changes from HR1 continue to take effect. Is there any reductions in grants and stuff like that? Although, again, New Mexico does have a little bit of an edge with our bases and our labs. So if there's any interest in, increased spending for those things, that might be a benefit. But it is a big decision faced by the legislature and the governor. If any federal funding goes away, what gets replaced, right? Like, so what can or what should be replaced by state funding? If some federal program goes away, some grant gets cut, is it an automatic decision that New Mexico should basically pick up the tab for it? Yeah, and that's going to depend on what was that money being spent on, how good is it, is it good use, things like that. Last year, Ohio passed a bill basically outlawing this practice. It basically said if the federal government cuts something, too bad, you don't get it in your budget. Okay, we don't have that here. Long-term funding for universal child care. So as I'm sure you know, universal child care was started to be implemented last fall. It was funded this past session, basically through 2031, I think, by basically so we have this early childhood trust fund, right? That's got 10-11 billion dollars in it. And that's one of those things where another kind of like benefit of timing, right? From all the oil boom, this trust fund got a ton of money in it, and now it's being used to fund early childhood universal child care. So it's funded through like 2031 or so by basically taking a little bit extra from the fund every year up until then. But it's not written to be a long-term solution, after 2031. So the legislature and the new governor are going to need to work together to come up with a kind of like more permanent funding solution for it. Let me check for questions before we wrap things. Last part here. Any questions from teams? Nope. Any questions here? Okay. Let's talk just a little bit about budgeting scholarship. So if you want to actually get into like studying how budgeting works and how all the different influences of budgeting work, there's only one guy that I'm going to throw at you. This will not be on the final, so you don't have to remember his name. But his name's Aaron Wildowski, and he's kind of like the guy in terms of like American US political budgeting scholarship. He wrote this book called The Politics of the Budgetary Process, and in 1964. And we were talking earlier about kind of like the politics and administration dichotomy. Well, he basically said, you can't separate budgeting from politics, right? It's just inseparable. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's just how it is in a representative democracy like ours. So because of that, the public and the policymakers need to be well informed of all the budgetary issues. He was a realist, right? He believed that there were compromises that, again, nobody's happy with everything they vote for in a budget, but basically that's better than any alternative. And he was also an incrementalist. He didn't necessarily believe in big sweeping changes. He thought you should use the prior year's budget as baseline and focus on narrow increases, kind of like evolution. Evolution usually doesn't happen in, big magical things all at once. It evolves over time. Okay. And then he updated it with a very creative new title book, The New Politics of the Budgetary Process. So we talked about like the growth of entitlements and deficit spending and stuff, right? So we thought, well, I better update my book to address the new kind of reality. So he did that, and he placed less emphasis on eliminating budget deficits because he just realized that was kind of, at that point, it had become inevitable. Again, he focused on the necessity of compromise in budget, accepting the budget that you want, because that means that you have to accept something else that you don't like or that you're indifferent. Because, think of everything that is funded by the state budget, right? Like everything from legislative district aids to court programs to natural resource programs to state police and correctional officers, higher education, transportation, road projects, right? Everyone wants roads and clean, safe to drive roads. All that's in the budget. So, I think you could take a look at the budget and you could probably find something you're like, this is stupid, right? Or I don't like this, but it's the budget, right? So you have to be on board with at least some of it. And that's how you manage to get budgets passed. He talked a little bit about how agencies request budgets, and he used the kind of Goldilocks metaphor. If you remember the Goldilocks and the Three Bears fairy tale, they have to ask for just the right amount of budget increase, right? If they ask for something that's too big, they look crazy or stupid or irresponsible, right? If they ask for too small, then they don't get what they need, right? So they're looking for that just right amount. They look for signals from legislators and the executive and their constituencies, to try to figure out what will be supported for what I ask for. And then entitlements opened up the budget to new clientele groups. Clientele groups, basically just like interest groups, advocacy groups. Thinking about like, the interest groups that formed around like Social Security, protecting that and stuff like that, right? So very these interest groups that defend that stuff and work to keep it going. He talked about, clientele groups or interest or advocacy groups. Basically, anyone affected by a government program, you can consider yourself part of that program's interest group, right? So everybody is part of some interest group, but some are more, kind of organized than others. All right, they interact with executive and legislative actors. He found that they would be more influential if they were broadly based, spread across a big geographic area, and intensely devoted to their cause. For example, like Social Security, or we're big on protecting Elephant Butte Reservoir, right? So we're this environmental group, and our big thing is protecting Elephant Butte Reservoir. So we're going to lobby all our local legislators and all the environmentally friendly legislators, both kind of arrows or both avenues, and try to get what we want, right? Hard to lobby to create entitlements because if you think about these are huge new government programs, so it's hard to get those across the finish line. But once they're existing, it's strong incentive to defend them. Okay. All right. So last, and this is something you can take with you and think about as you're putting together your FY28 budget request over the next month or so. When you're putting together a budget request, what are some things that you should think about, right? And some questions that you should answer that are going to help get the point across for what you need. So first, what's the problem, right? Clearly identify the problem that you're trying to address through your budget request. Let's just say you're requesting to create some new grant program or something like that, right, at your agency. So what's the problem, right? Is it a societal issue? Is it are you remedying an externality, right? An externality, if you don't know, that's some problem that is created by the costs of which are not borne by the people who make it, right? So in the before the EPA, pollution, right, was an externality, right? Because like companies could just put whatever they wanted in the river, right? And they didn't pay for it, but society paid for it, right? So the idea was, okay, well, we need to create an EPA and a fee and penalty structure so that those that are responsible for pollution, they have to pay for it, right? So that's remedying externality or operational efficiency. You can even get, philosophical and be like, is this a problem? And think about, is this a problem that government should even be addressing, right? Is this a good use of taxpayers' dollars? If my money is going towards this program, which, if I live in New Mexico, it is, would I be okay with supporting it? Or like think that it's a good use of taxpayer dollars, okay? Be specific, provide data and evidence demonstrating the problem, compare problems, data, and possible solutions with other states. It's oftentimes you're not the first person in the country to think of this issue or this program. So look and see what other states have done. You just want to be careful, like the relevant thing here to compare with, states that make sense to compare New Mexico to. It might not be appropriate to compare us to California or Texas or New York. Choose a state with similar, size and demographics and stuff like that. Okay. Demonstrating the need, like be realistic. Try to meet the actual demand, not the perceived demand. Does this request address federal or state mandates, right? That's always a big one. New legislation was passed last year that requires your agency to do these new things. The legislature, will often not provide any funding specifically for that purpose. So now you're saying, okay, well, our agency needs, $500,000 to implement Senate Bill 264 or whatever from last year. Okay, and here's why. Here's how that money will be spent. History of caseload, expenditure and revenue trends, inflationary costs. Right, just show us a history and trends. Right, go back a couple years. Show us your actual expenditures. Are they growing? Why are they growing? And how does that tie into what you're requesting? Review the methodology, right? Make sure that your data is sound, your methods are sound, that your math is good. Nothing worse than turning in a budget request with bad math in it. So make sure you check that. And then if you can, tie it to your performance measures, right? How will I've got this performance measure. If you increase my budget, if you give us money for this, we will be able to improve our performance on these two performance measures because it's going to give us, 2 more people to do these things, something like that. Funding amounts and alternatives. So I think as we've kind of talked about today, general fund is, the hardest to get. It's the most tightly controlled. So are there options for non-general fund revenue, right? Can I get this from fees? Can I get this from federal money? Is there any way that I can avoid having to ask for general fund for this purpose? Okay. Does the request need to be recurring? Right? Do I have to put it into my base budget first? Is that appropriate? Because I'm just absolutely sure this new program is going to be awesome, so I want it recurring. Or should you go with a more phased-in approach, like a pilot project? Or should it be like non-recurring to start out with? Maybe, give us $1 million this year. We'll see how things go, and then maybe we can build it in recurring after that. Will a new program be fully operational on July 1st? Right. Sometimes we'll see this where they want, full costs of the program for the whole fiscal year. And it'll be like, yeah, we're going to have 10 FTE. Like, well, are all those 10 FTE going to be filled on July 1st? I mean, it's possible, right? I don't want to rule it out entirely, but maybe not, right? So do you need the full amount of the program in the first year? Can you get by with half or 2/3 or something like that? And then with the expectation that you will ramp up. Okay. Remember to be realistic about vacancy rates. We already talked about that this morning. And then think about potential hidden or delayed costs that could impact future budgets, right? Like operational costs of some new facility. We've got this new clinic. How are you going to staff it? I was like, oh crap, we need to hire 10 people next year, right? So think about those sort of things that are maybe not reflected this year, but you're going to need further down the line. And how hard is it going to be to fill those needs, in future years? Okay. And then just some kind of final gut checks. Again, is it a real problem? Should the government respond? Is it appropriate? And will it work? Are we duplicating someone else's effort, right? Think about if you've got an agency that does something similar, like, we've got some natural resource agencies that do different things, but they do some similar things too. You want to make sure that you're not, just doing something that someone else is doing. So keep that in mind. Again, check your math. Do the numbers match the narrative? And check your historical trends, your actuals data, all sort of like that. Is there anything we can cut, right? Is there anything that this program is, just not working out? So we should eliminate that program and maybe we can replace it with this more promising one. And then how well are we using data and evidence to support this request, from identifying the problem to proposing an effective solution, right? So all the way through the process, the more data you can provide in support of, what things will do, how things will be accomplished, the better. Okay. So last slide for today, and this is always my little kind of pep talk before I send you off for today. Just remember that everyone here is important and that you're not just a cog. Although sometimes I get it too. I know our staff gets it too. We can feel like it. You're just a cog in the machine that's churning out numbers, getting stuff done. And I get it. It's really easy for us all to feel like that. But you're not. everyone here is important and everyone here has their role to play with whatever they do at their agency. So remember that you don't operate. Sorry. Remember, you don't operate in a vacuum, right? No matter what you do, you're an integral part of producing the budget and the vital policy. Okay. So I talked about how the budget is the most important policy document produced by a government, right, every year or every other year. So I like to close with this quote from President Biden. I think I think it can apply no matter what your own kind of ideological beliefs are, because that reflects into your budget no matter what you think. But he would say, don't tell me what you value, right? Show me your budget and I will tell you what you value, right? Because what you value is reflected in your budget, right? And that goes for anyone. So that's why the budget is so important. And you're all a really big, important part of making it. Even if you aren't the deciders, right? You get to implement it help create it. So it's important for you to fully understand, the political world that surrounds them. Like we talked about with Aaron Wildowski, you just can't separate budget from politics. So it's important to, be aware of that stuff, even again, if you aren't actually a political employee or a major player in the process or whatever. It's still very important to just kind of be informed about that stuff. Because we have to balance, right, being properly responsive to the will of the electorate, right? We're in a representative democracy, so we want to try to be responsive to them. But also we're all administrators, we're all bureaucrats, civil servants, whatever you want to call us. So we're performing our administrative and our technical roles to the best of our ability, right? That's the big balance that we all deal with, right? And last, this is what we deal with. It kind of goes back to that first poll I showed you, but it's true, right? Americans expect well-run, efficient, and generous government services, but they do not want to pay for them, right? And that's just the world we live in, and that is the balancing act that all of us have to work with. Okay? Any questions? Check Teams. Any questions from Teams? All right. Anything else? Finished a little early for today, so go enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for coming. Thanks, Teams folks. If you have any questions, I'll stick around here for a few more minutes. But otherwise, we will see you tomorrow for budget management documents. Thanks, everybody. Yes, Phil, recordings will be available either on Friday or maybe early next week.